JC McGhee lived a life full of contradictions. Once a drug dealer turned confidential informant, he was also a bar owner, a father, and a man trying to leave his troubled past behind him. But in July of 2002, his life was brutally cut short in an execution-style killing that remains unsolved to this day. Despite a series of shocking events leading up to his death and a deeply flawed investigation, justice has yet to be served. I'm Melissa.
And I'm Whitney. Join us on Navigating Advocacy as we unravel the complex story of JC McGhee, uncover the truths his daughter Madison has fought to bring to light, and explore the dark secrets, lies, and corruption that continues throughout this case.
Let's start at the beginning. John Cornelius McGhee was born on May 4th, 1957, in Wheeling, West Virginia, and was the son of Daisy Womack McGhee Pearson and Charles Green McGhee. Most people referred to John as JC.
Madison McGhee is JC's daughter, and she lovingly described her dad as an interesting but dynamic character. She said that he was a womanizer and that she had several siblings, some that she didn't even know until after his death. He would call himself an entrepreneur, but in reality, he was a drug dealer. As a kid, you aren't always capable of seeing the true professions of adults. Madison didn't know her father was a drug dealer until later in life. Her memories of JC include riding around and listening to incredibly inappropriate rap music for her age. While she didn't grow up with him in her household, he was very present in her life. He would visit regularly, and he really wanted her to play basketball. Madison really didn't have a clue why he wanted her to play it so badly, but he was always asking her to play. She explained that her memories with her dad are more of character development pieces in her life. Now, looking back, she feels as if he was teaching her to make something of herself. And playing basketball would likely get you a scholarship, get you out of that town and onto bigger and better things. So perhaps that's why he pushed it so hard.
And maybe that was just one of the few things that he felt like he could connect with her, especially a dad with a daughter that he didn't get to see her all the time. There's just not a lot. What's he going to do? Play Barbie? But basketball was something that, boys like, girls like. So maybe he kind of just thought this is one way to connect with her.
Definitely could be. Let me give a little bit more context about this area. Madison described this small Appalachian town as a weird industrial hub that had drugs funneling in from other major cities. It sits on the border of West Virginia and Ohio, and the Ohio River separates the two. The population now is just over 27,000, but in 2002, it was over 30,000. So it may be a little bit confusing with the story because this is our Ohio episode, but we talk a lot about West Virginia. That's because JC lived in Ohio, but that bar he owned was across the border in Wheeling.
So this bar that JC owned was named Johnny Cool's, which I have to say it's a really cute name. I feel like it would have the vibes that we would like to go to. It was a hotspot for nightlife, but it was also a front for illegal activities. He allowed his nephew Rico to sell drugs out of the bar while he had sex workers operating upstairs.
Johnny Cool's sounds to be quite the happening place in the 90s, but there's only so long you can have a place that is known for sex work and drugs before the cops catch on. This put JC in a precarious situation. Law enforcement was watching the drug trade closely, especially when it came to Rico. Madison told me that they basically approached JC and said, "Look, dude, we know what's happening. You can help us out or you can go down too."
So when the FBI raided Johnny Cool's, JC knew he was in deep trouble. Rather than go down with the ship, he flipped on Rico, testifying against him and sending him to prison for a significant amount of time. This is for racketeering and drug trafficking charges.
JC was really backed into a corner at this point. Now he had to continue his role as a confidential informant. Once you turn, you can't really go back. Madison called it a golden handcuff. And I think that's the perfect metaphor for it. He couldn't stop providing information to law enforcement, or they could take him down for any number of criminal behaviors they already had witnessed him doing. But on the other side of that,
This move made JC a lot of enemies. People who were once friends and allies in this drug world now saw him as a traitor. Many of these drug related offenses could also come with significant offenses. I mean, they were selling drugs, they weren't just doing the drugs. And if you don't know how that works, trafficking the drugs, you're going to get much more time in prison than doing the drugs yourself. With these border towns, state lines play a huge role in the charges and can make prosecution incredibly unfair. For example, let's say if you stay within state lines, drug charges are held at state level, usually meaning shorter sentences. Once you cross that border, it becomes a federal offense. So towns like Wheeling, West Virginia are targeted and watched closely for drug activity. Even though it's only a few miles over into Ohio, that is still transporting these drugs across state lines, which will get you that heavy sentence. This drug game wasn't JC's entire identity. He was charming, funny, and strict with his daughter, Alyssa. He didn't want her to end up like him, so he kept her on the straight and narrow. He loved women and fast cars and was a man of many talents. He was musical, artsy, and had a wide circle of friends. But despite his efforts to turn his life around, his past was never far behind him.
one of JC's ex girlfriends, Deneen, had given birth to a baby boy in Ohio. But before we tell you about Madison's half brother, let's take a few steps backwards to give you a little bit of backstory about Deneen. Deneen and JC met while she was working as a sex worker. I'm not sure if Deneen worked at Johnny Cole's or just in the area or how the two developed a relationship, but they were in one at one point when Deneen found out she was pregnant. At the time, there was a house in Philadelphia that took in sex workers while they were pregnant. The woman who operated this house was named Madame Marie, and she would help these women stay clean while they were pregnant, provide them with health care, and then illegally adopt out the babies once they were born. Now, when we originally decided to take on JC's story, I never could have imagined all of these different facets that we uncover here. And this brothel turned illegal adoption ring was not on my bingo card.
Absolutely not. And when I was researching for this and I found this, I'm like, there is no way that this is true. Uh, but it's true, and it's probably one of the most insane things that we have ever learned about. And I don't think I can go back to the person I was before I knew this.
And it was a full scale operation. Several people were involved, lots of people on the payroll. Madame Marie would charge families looking for the babies $20,000 per child. The money would be split evenly between four parties. 5,000 to Madame Marie for orchestrating, I guess, the entire adoption. 5,000 to the doctor who delivered the baby to keep him quiet. $5,000 to the lawyer to draw up all of the adoption paperwork, and then 5,000 to the mom. So everyone was paid an equal share. JC drove Deneen to Philadelphia to live with Madame Marie in order to give the baby up for adoption at the end of her pregnancy. Deneen struggled with substance abuse and continued to use heroin throughout her pregnancy. Before Deneen gave birth, a local Philadelphia police officer and his wife, who was a school teacher, who were unable to have kids, paid for an adoption through Madame Marie. Now, when I first read this, I thought it was he's undercover. They're going to crack down on this. This is all part of the plan. This is yet another facet of confidential informant. And I was prepared for the raid to happen, but it doesn't. They were legitimately looking for a baby to love, a child to love. Deneen gave birth to Shane. but because she relapsed while she was at the home in Philadelphia, Shane was born addicted to heroin. Madison told me that the story shifts depending on who tells it. One person said that the adopted couple took Shane home and that Deneen decided to take him back 3 days later, while another person says that Deneen just took Shane home from the hospital originally. Ultimately, we know that Shane ended up in Deneen's custody after she learned about him being born addicted to heroin. He would receive a social security check and be on disability for the rest of his life, so she essentially saw it as a payday.
After she's already been paid to give her baby to these other people, she was like, "Hey, now here's a way for me to get paid for the next 18 years."
Correct. And what does that family have? They don't really have any legal recourse because they are also a part of this illegal adoption situation. So they can't say, hey, we gave these people $20,000. Can I get my money back? You can't take them to civil court over this for unpaid services
Yeah,
because they agreed to this illegal adoption.
and they can't file a police report or they would be charged with something as well. So this whole time, the whole pregnancy, JC's not even for sure that this baby Deneen is carrying is his. I mean, obviously she was a sex worker, so she was sleeping with more than just JC at this point in time. But it wasn't until after Shane is born that they realize that this is JC's child. This leads to a custody battle between Deneen and JC for Shane. On July 12th of 2002, JC was scheduled to appear in court for the last of several custody hearings. But unfortunately, JC would never make it. Early in the morning of July 11th, 2002, around 6:40 a.m., the door to JC's home in Bridgeport, Ohio, was kicked in. JC was shot once in the head, an execution-style killing. His daughter Alyssa found him. She was woken up by the sound of a gunshot and discovered her father's bloody and lifeless body in the doorway. She immediately called 911. It was a scene like no one should ever have to witness, especially someone's child. But this wasn't just a simple home invasion. Earlier that morning, the neighbor's house had been broken into. I want to mention the neighbors are relatives of JC. The intruders are apparently a group of around 4 men dressed in black, armed with shotguns and pistols. They had burst into the home of Pearl, who is JC's sister. Okay, they tied up Pearl and her son Omar's girlfriend, Kim, with a telephone cord, and they are ransacking the house. They're demanding drugs and money. So these men seemed serious. They were threatening to set them on fire after they doused them in alcohol. Also in the home at this time is Omar. Omar's in the whole drug scene as well.
But Omar wasn't tied up.
I do not believe Omar was tied up because the men end up taking Omar outside, and he wasn't tied up when police ended up finding him. So somehow they take or for some reason, we really don't know. They take Omar outside, and I don't know in how this happens, but Omar somehow manages to escape, and he fled to a nearby auto body shop. I don't know what kind, if it's like brakes or an oil change place, but some kind of shop just down the road. And he calls 911 from this business. There's a woman that's driving by, Barbara. She sees Omar there and he's half dressed. I believe he's only in boxers, and she sees him and she's just, oh, that's weird. That's the end of that. So Omar will call 911 and he tells the dispatcher about what happened at his house. But he also mentions that his neighbor's house was broken into as well, and someone was shot there. And it's weird to me, maybe not to everyone, that he says his neighbor's house instead of saying like his uncle or my uncle JC's. Like he knows who lives there. The fact that he says just his neighbor is, I find that weird.
Well, I also find it weird that he knew someone was shot there. Because if the 911 call is happening completely separate, Alyssa calls 911 completely separate. Is the front door open? Did he see it when they took him outside? How you What's the layout situation here? He just somehow knew? Did he hear a gunshot? I have more questions about this
Exactly.
specifically.
Exactly. And so there's was reports that said Omar was like, maybe my uncle has the drugs or money, and there's something about a safe that they were looking for. So maybe that's why they ran over there, and that's when he escaped. That whole part about his escape and how they ended up at JC's house is so vague and not understood at all. And there's lots of stories that have been changed throughout the year about what really happened after they left Pearl's house. So, definitely weird that he just said, "My neighbor." Omar clearly knew that this house was his uncle, not just some random neighbor. But despite the chaos, the police's response was far from adequate. Even though someone had been shot at JC's address and a 911 call came from a scared teenager, police went to Pearl's house first. So, of course, I try to give the police the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they thought people were hurt over at that house as well. But I don't know. If you knew the fact that someone was for sure shot, wouldn't that be the first place you would go? It shouldn't they have enough freaking cops that some can go there and some can go there? Like, let's divide and conquer.
I mean, I guess granted, depending on the emergency of the situation, I would also assume that you would go to the gunshot wound first. But if they're side by side or in the same complex across the walkway, literally in the same area, can they not be at the same place? Why are they not responding to both situations? There's got to be more than one cop present. Surely.
Agreed. Especially for a home invasion and shots fired. They better be bringing multiple people. But that wasn't the only aspect of this investigation that seemed shoddy. Police didn't tape off the crime scene. And by the time that Alyssa had returned home from her questioning at the police station, their family had already begun cleaning up the blood themselves.
This is 2002. This is not 1950 where they didn't care about who trampled through the crime scene. They didn't take into consideration footprints or anything like that. This is 2002. They know better.
Exactly. It's so weird that nobody like really cared to keep this crime scene legit. So Alyssa is kind of upset that all this family is in their house. And so she's asking them, "What are you guys doing?" They say that they're looking for an insurance policy. But Alyssa also believes that they were removing guns from the house as well. JC had a bunch of guns. And by the time she returned, there was no guns left in that house. Daryl Smith was arrested. So maybe police are doing something in the background all the time and not just because there was hardly any articles about JC's murder. And then this whole thing with Daryl came out a couple months later.
Interesting.
So Pearl, Omar, and Kim all identified Daryl as one of the men involved in the home invasion at their house. Dare said this was the guy, so police went ahead and arrested him. But as the case went to a grand jury, Omar's story kept changing. He would end up lying on the stand, lying to police, and the case against Daryl literally just fell apart. So they ended up releasing him after a few months.
It's interesting that he didn't get taken down for perjury.
Right? Right? Because this dude Omar has had 100 stories all the time. Like, it's insane the amount of stories that he has had.
Hmm.
So then we have Deneen, obviously, as the suspect. So this was Shane's mom, JC's ex girlfriend. So she passes away in 2020. But back in 2002, she was one of the first suspects. I mean, obviously, with her and JC's custody hearing scheduled for like a day or two after he was murdered, it's a little bit suspect that, or she, of course, would be the number one suspect. She has every reason to want JC out of the picture. So she would get to keep Shane, which meant she got to keep the Social Security benefits.
I agree. Given the I know that they usually lean towards the mom in most states, but given her, history with substance abuse, I it sounds like she may not have, safe environment. Of the 2, it seemed that JC was a little more stable than
Uh,
Deneen.
Most definitely. JC had custody of Alyssa. He had his own
Mhm.
house. Like he was doing better within the community way more so than Deneen and then Deneen's boyfriend, eventual husband was doing at that time. In her initial interview, she mentioned hearing rumors that Omar was the one who pulled the trigger and killed JC. And this was just hours after JC was murdered. Obviously, she was one of the first people to come in and interview, and that's what she said. Oh, but of course, there was no actual evidence of this. So the case went cold, and we don't really know how much they investigated it to begin with. It wasn't until about a decade later when his daughter, Madison, would actually learn about what happened to her father that night. See, she had always been told that JC had died of a heart attack. And she was only 6 years old when he passed, and her mother's family didn't think it was appropriate to tell her the truth then.
So in 2012, when she was 16, she was visiting her father's side of the family for the first time since the funeral with her mom. The two had decided to purchase a headstone for JC's grave. And before it seems kind of super out of the blue, why did suddenly a decade later you decide to do this? Madison's best friend's dad had a headstone company, so they just decided to craft one to replace JC's grave marker. And while there, when they were installing it, they went to visit it, and she was meeting with her father's family for the first time in a very, very long time. While there, Madison had what she calls a very strange gut feeling, almost premonition, when she met eyes with Omar, who is her cousin, as they were leaving. She said it was like a gut punch, and she almost saw a movie in her head of Omar standing next to her father while he was dying. Now, believe what you want to believe, but when she is telling me this story, she became very animated of like, this is what happened to me, and I would not know about this without this moment happening.
This is just absolutely wild, and there are things like this that happen that totally make and break cases, because if it wasn't for that moment, she would have probably never started investigating on her own.
Exactly. And it gives me the chills. She got into the car and she immediately asked her mom, was Omar there when dad died? And remember, at this point, she thought he had had a heart attack up until this exact moment. Madison's mom shared the truth that JC was murdered and that his case was unsolved. She really didn't give a lot more information than that, just, we didn't tell you because you were too young. And she did confirm that Omar had a connection to that day, and it was just all very strange that Madison was able to put things together that Omar could have been present when JC was murdered without even knowing her dad had been murdered. She wondered if she would have ever been told the truth without this strange interaction. Her mom said that she couldn't really find the right time, but she was 6. And then as time passed, it just became harder and harder to tell the truth. Then it's high school graduation. Then it's, she graduates college, all these big momentous occasions. Do you want to taint those memories by saying, hey, I've been lying to you for a decade? So she just couldn't do it.
Yeah, and it's not something you just say over cereal on a Tuesday morning, though, either. The more time passes, it's harder to reveal this huge truth bomb. So, understandable. Her mom's side of the family obviously felt horrible about not telling her the truth, but back then they thought they were doing the right thing. Madison didn't meet most of her father's side of the family.
After the funeral, they were out of her life. It wasn't something she realized she was missing until she was in high school. She remembers seeing her friends go to visit other sides of their family, especially around holidays, and she didn't have that same experience. As time passed, the knowledge of her dad's murder began weighing on her. She graduated high school and moved to Australia for about 2 years before returning to the United States. She called it a fresh start, new adventures, new projects, but her dad's story kept coming forward in her mind. She was 24 years old and navigating a new world. Then, 6 months later, COVID hit. The isolation allowed her to plant a seed of creativity. And after binging all of the shows we all watched, the documentaries, the podcast, all the things that we did during the lockdown to keep ourselves entertained, the idea to dive into her father's story continued to grow. And she started how a lot of us do, with little knowledge on how to investigate things. She didn't even file a Freedom of Information request. She called the police department and simply asked for the case file. They initially gave her the runaround, but after she continued to call and call and call, they finally relinquished the file to her as she started digging in. This file was a treasure trove of new information for Madison. Up until this point, she didn't know her father was a drug dealer or a confidential informant. All she had been told was that her dad had been murdered. She didn't know that other family members were involved in the drug industry. She said that every turn was a surprise. I don't think she even knew about Shane at this point. Madison became fully immersed in her father's story. The town, its inhabitants, and the culture surrounding it has ties to so many bigger things that she never knew even existed.
Armed with this case file, she followed every lead, no matter how small. Many of the names in the file were redacted, but being a small town, she was able to connect the dots. She started with the people she knew, and of course, people talk. So before long, it was known that Madison was asking questions. Most leads led to dead ends because people weren't really interested in sharing information, maybe out of fear. Some of the family members just weren't happy that she was digging into this. They wanted to leave the past in the past. Or was it something more sinister? Could any of them be involved? Madison actually met with Daryl Smith, trying to understand what really happened that morning. She even tracked down Kim, who the police claimed they couldn't find. The truth is out there, but tangled in a web of lies, fears, and perhaps even corruption.
Madison created Ice Cold Case, her podcast, in an attempt to garner more attention to her father's murder. We barely have scratched the surface on JC's story, and we cannot encourage you to listen to this podcast enough. Madison has released 2 installments already and is currently working on the third. She's building the case file from scratch, conducting forensic research, and recreating the scenes, literally running from point A to point B to see if the timeline can fit. She's working with scientists to prove or disprove theories, using testimonies already in the case file in an attempt to garner justice for JC. She's going to compile everything she learns, the data she gathers, and hand it to law enforcement and ask them to simply do their job.
JC McGhee was more than just another drug dealer. He was a father, a brother, a friend. He was a man who made mistakes but was trying to make things right. His life was stolen from him in the most brutal way, and nearly 22 years later, his murder remains unsolved. The police may have concluded that this was just another drug dealer getting killed because of his line of work, but many people in his family know there's more to the story. This family deserves answers. JC deserves justice, and so do all of the other families out there who have lost loved ones to violence, only to have their cases dismissed, mishandled, or forgotten. We can't let that happen.
I asked Madison how you and I could help Melissa. Short of sharing JC's story, she said that the advocacy piece has been the hardest part. She started this journey with the intent of getting her podcast to the #1 spot. In her mind, that was the only way to get justice for JC. Make the noise, get the recognition, make people care so that there are many people advocating for him instead of just her. If it's big enough of a podcast, it will make people and law enforcement feel the pressure to do something, say something. So help us get Madison's podcast to #1. Get on your favorite podcast platform, subscribe, rate it 5 stars. Believe me, it is worth all 5. And leave a review. You do not understand how much it helps the algorithm in getting these stories in front of new people. That is what's needed. That is what JC needs. Getting in front of people who are ready to take action. Y'all know that Melissa and I are all about taking action. We too will be pushing for justice for JC. We have a flowering campaign in progress targeting the areas Madison feels will be the most successful in encouraging those who may know something to come forward.
Thank you for listening to Navigating Advocacy. If you have a loved one who is a victim of an unsolved homicide or who is currently missing, submit their case for consideration in a future episode on our website.
Thank you to Madison McGhee for sharing your father's story with us. This episode was written, researched, and produced by us. Please consider also leaving us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform or sharing us with a friend. It truly helps us help more families, because we will be there no matter where,
No matter who.